Hello and welcome. My name is Meepolis, they, she, he, and this is literally graphic. And today we are finally looking at V for Vendetta, a comic I reread a while back, but have been really good at procrastinating on because the prospect of trying to talk about it just filled me with anxiety for whatever reason. As you probably already know, this book was written by Alan Moore and illustrated by David Lloyd. Steve Whitaker and Siobhan Dodds were on colors, and select chapters were drawn by Tony Weir. It's also obviously been adapted into a movie by the Wachowski sisters and director James McTough in 2005, which I assume I'll talk about a bit as well because I do have opinions. Oh, this comic is rated by DC Comics 17+. Content notes for R-word, sexual violence against women and sex workers, underage, clergy sexual abuse, bombs, assassinations, terrorism, concentration camps, emotional and physical abuse, sex and nudity, chopped up bodies, and the N-word. Giving a brief overview of the publishing history of V for Vendetta, apparently it was initially launched as a black and white comic in the UK anthology magazine Warrior in 1982. The magazine ended in 1985 before the end of V. There was apparently a lot of interest from a number of publishers to get Moore and Lloyd to continue the series. Eventually, the Warrior era was republished in 1988 in full color by DC Comics, who were also granted the rights to publish the rest of the story as well. Collected editions were subsequently published by Vertigo until it also ended, and according to Wikipedia, it is currently being published by DC's new mature imprint Black Label. Moving along to creator biographies, another intimidating part of this whole thing, as I'm sure I'll be sending people back here a few times as I move forward in Moore's bibliography. Looking at the Britannica website, British writer Alan Moore was born in 1953 in Northampton, England. His first work was published in the early 70s with stories for Doctor Who Weekly and 2000 AD, as well as fanzines and parodies of Paddington Bear. Other early work included resurrecting the classic British hero Marvel Man/Miracle Man, followed by V for Vendetta. Other comics titles to Moore's name, in somewhat chronological order: The Ballad of Halo Jones, Swamp Thing, which is on my Vertigo schedule after Sandman, Watchmen, whose reviews I'm also procrastinating on, Batman the Killing Joke, not sure if I'll ever try to review this again, really not a fan, From Hell, Big Numbers, A Small Killing, Lost Girls, Promethea, Tom Strong, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Courtyard, Neonomicon, Fashion Beast, and Providence. A number of Moore's work, despite his resistance, has been adapted for screen, including From Hell, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, V for Vendetta, and Watchmen. He's also been recognized and awarded extensively. Clicking over to Wikipedia, Moore self-describes as an occultist, ceremonial magician, and anarchist. Other points of note is he was born into a working-class family, was in a throuple for a while, has 2 daughters. He called Frank Miller's recent work misogynist, homophobic, and misguided in 2011. Although I would say it was there since the beginning, after he complimented his realistic use of minimal dialogue in fight scenes in 2003. David Lloyd was born in Enfield, London. He also started working in comics in the 70s, this time drawing for Halls of Horror and other titles for Marvel UK. He co-created Night Raven with Steve Parkhouse and apparently worked with Moore on several Doctor Who stories before co-creating V for Vendetta. According to Wikipedia, Lloyd illustrated V for Vendetta in a cinematic chiaroscuro style and devised V's Guy Fawkes-inspired appearance, which has obviously been picked up by a number of different social movements since then. Lloyd also worked on Wasteland, Hellblazer, Sandman Mystery Theater, The Territory, and Kickback, among others. As I already mentioned, V for Vendetta was originally published in straight black and white, but when DC became involved, it was eventually colored by Steve Whitaker and Siobhan Dodds. According to Wikipedia, besides coloring V for Vendetta, Steve Whitaker also worked on Saga of the Man-Elf, Saint Swithin's Day, The Last Party on Earth, The Encyclopedia of Cartooning Techniques, and Street Fighter II, the manga. David Lloyd apparently described him as, quote, not only one of the finest colorists Britain has ever produced, but a great artist, a scholar of the comics medium, and a great teacher with whom I worked at the London Cartoon Centre in its various incarnations. End quote. I have so far not been able to track down almost any information about Siobhan Dodds, except for that he was selling off his collection of work from V for Vendetta on Comic Art Fans as of 2012. Tony Weary, born 1912 and died in 1994, according to Lambic.net. He took 3 years of art courses while working in the tobacco industry. He started publishing before World War II and continued again after the war. Tony worked on things like Mickey Mouse Weekly and a Western comic for the Associated Newspaper Agency. According to Wikipedia, Lloyd was a big fan of Weir's work and invited him to contribute a few sequences in V for Vendetta. What kinds of keywords came to mind? Reading, V for Vendetta. Coming of age, dystopia, fascism, Big Brother, terrorism, revenge, loner, propaganda, mass movements, hypocrisy, strategy, survival, torture, ends and means, circus, and gender. Looking back over at Goodreads, the synopsis is, quote, a frightening and powerful tale of the loss of freedom and identity in a chillingly believable totalitarian world. V for Vendetta stands as one of the highest achievements of the comics medium and a defining work for creators Alan Moore and David Lloyd. Set in an imagined future England that has given itself over to fascism, this groundbreaking story captures both the suffocating nature of life in an authoritarian police state and the redemptive power of the human spirit, which rebels against it. Crafted with sterling clarity and intelligence, V for Vendetta brings an unequaled depth of characterization and verisimilitude to its unflinching account of oppression and resistance. End quote. Originally published in the late 80s and early 90s, it is perhaps needless to say that V for Vendetta has become a cultural phenomenon. As usual, I give all my stock warnings that when V was originally published, I was quite literally a babe in arms, and have not become an expert in the time period since then, especially how it was over on the other side of the pond. As such, I am approaching this book as a person who read it first in the context of 2013, and now in the context of 2022. I am also not an Alan Moore expert. I've read some of his books previously, and I hope that this is the first in a few more reads and rereads of at least some of his work. Previously, Moore has stood out in my mind as better than many of his peers, but he's certainly not perfect and or above critique. Revisiting Moore's work is part of my effort to become more aware of him as a whole. Based off of my rereading of other mature comics of his type, yes, I'm looking at you, Sandman, I suspect I'll be more critical this time around than previously. We shall see. But yes, disclaimer aside and circling back to the text at hand, V for Vendetta is definitely one of the more overtly political comics that I have talked about, and rereading it, I do think it presents a number of interesting questions about authoritarianism and revolution, with a few answers also being suggested by the way Moore decides to end it. Interestingly enough, as I was procrastinating on writing this review, a video crossed my subscription feed. Not only did this video remind me of some political jargon I'm pretty sure I knew before but had forgotten, this jargon perfectly described what happens at the end of V for Vendetta, namely propaganda of the deed. Clicking over to Wikipedia, propaganda of the deed, or propaganda by the deed, is specific political direct action meant to be exemplary to others and serve as a catalyst for revolution. It is primarily associated with acts of violence perpetrated by proponents of insurrectionary anarchism in the late 19th and early 20th century, including bombings and assassinations aimed at the ruling class, but also had nonviolent applications. These deeds were indeed intended to ignite the spirit of the revolt in the people by demonstrating the state was not omnipotent and by offering hope to the downtrodden, and also to expand support for anarchist movements as the state grew more repressive in its response. In 1881, the International Anarchist Congress of London gave the tactic its approval. End quote. Needless to say, this tactic is, especially when it manifests in more violent ways, not without its critics. You can learn more about common criticisms over at The People's Bayonet in the video titled Terrorism is Bad Praxis, which might also be a tell about how long it's taken me to make this video. Similarly, as I continue to not finish the script, I listened to the short podcast series Mother Country Radicals, published by Crooked Media, child of weather underground organizers, and born while said parents were living underground. Zaid Dorn, quote, takes us back to the 1970s when his parents and their young friends brawled with riot cops on the streets of Chicago, bombed the Pentagon and the U.S. Capitol, and teamed up with black militant groups to rob banks, fight racism, and help build a revolution. End quote. Which was also a pretty interesting listen. Moving along to point 2, I don't think I'll find a video to link for this one or fancy political jargon, so I'll just have to describe it myself. I suspect you can't traumatize people into revolutionary action. Maybe you could, TLDR, with the ends don't justify the means. But it also just seems like it wouldn't work in a terribly reliable way, I don't think, because traumatized people need more room in their life to cope, and that would, to put it bluntly, distract from the need for revolution. Obviously, people who are oppressed, abused, and treated as less than human will try and fight back. See all the uprisings of enslaved Black people in so-called America, and Jewish people during World War II, some of which did see some success. But I'm pretty sure the way V completely strips away Evie's personhood would be extremely difficult to bounce back from. It certainly is more risky and less efficient than, dare I say, milder ways of getting people to care about violent authoritarianism. That said, obviously V was suffering their own level of trauma and abuse that they are reacting to as well. And as the saying goes, hurt people hurt people. Moore set out to create an antagonist that is flawed and imperfect, so obviously what V does is not necessarily marked with a gold seal of approval by even him. But in my experience, it is easy to get distracted by things that do or don't work in fiction, and it's my video, so I get to say what I want and go on the tangents I feel like going on. Looking at the art and the writing of V for Vendetta, I definitely fall on the side of the art style not being my favorite. I mean, I think it was interesting and well executed, just not a style that I generally love. Writing-wise, I'm sticking to my earlier opinion that this book is very well written, more intricate, sensical, and thought-provoking than most Vertigo comics I have read, hands down, although I'm not claiming to be unbiased. But to pivot for a few minutes, I wanted to talk a little bit about what kinds of changes were made between the graphic novel and the movie. Obviously, I don't review movies, and I don't plan on starting now, but in this case, I do have strong feelings about some of the changes made during the adaptation. Links in the description to some of those spot the differences videos I watched to make sure I wasn't completely fabricating these comments, and for some relevant quotes from Moore. Do I need to mention that Alan Moore doesn't like movie adaptations of his work? Probably not. I think that started with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen adaptation, and I really can't say that I blame the guy. That was a shit movie. That said, according to an interview from 2011 with David Lloyd that I found on YouTube, both Lloyd and Moore were interested in having the comic adapted to film or TV originally, and Lloyd, as of that point, thought that the movie adaptation was good, if not quite as good as the original. Plus, he agreed that From Hell and League were both horrible movies, and might be why Moore's opinion on film adaptations changed. Content note for this interview taking place about somewhere in the year before Lana Wachowski first came out publicly, so dead names are used. The biggest difference, to my mind, was the attempt to update the conflict to better reflect the overreach of the US Bush government after 9/11. Moore described it as moving the conflict from anarchism versus fascism to liberalism versus conservatism, which was definitely my first impression of the movie back when I watched it in the early 2010s. This effectively lowers the stakes considerably, which seems counterproductive. The next biggest difference gets a little bit into my analysis of gender, and is the way Evie is portrayed in the movie versus the comic book. For better or for worse, V for Vendetta is the only book adapted to screen, at least that I have come across so far, where I thought it was a good idea to have the female character be less empowered. Some of this is definitely related to the defanging of the politics that we already touched on, but I couldn't help but get a bit obsessed with why I feel this way about Evie. But it isn't just that Evie is weaker and more naive in a vacuum. Rather, the fascist authoritarian culture she is steeped in requires her and has trained her to be a more cookie-cutter woman, TM, which comes with all the baggage of the stereotypical gender role. When Evie in the movie is already a spunky journalist type, this not only cuts off the start of her character arc, it also dampens the queer break with stereotypical gender roles. It's not a matter of old-fashioned versus modern, but these gender norms are something that fascist authoritarian culture will always try to revert to as part of their state of being. Policing people's fertility and reproduction, prohibiting the quote wrong kinds of reproduction, enforcing the quote right kinds of reproduction is vital. And being any sort of queer messes that up. And finally, another issue I took with the movie over the comic is how the personalities of the government and the media are much more black and white. In the comic, while the government/media are clearly fascist, they are somewhat developed and humanized in ways that point towards the complexity of people who do bad things. Even if we don't have any sympathy for them, they can be normal people and not just supervillains. In the movie, it feels like the personalities of the government and media are either cartoonishly evil or end up opposing the government in the end. And of course, on the flip side, V in the movie is more gold seal of approval good than in the book, where we do seem to be encouraged to question the nature of V at certain points. Going through the different kinds of representation that I do, as usual, let's start with gender and sexuality. Obviously, we already talked a lot about the nature of gender under fascism, but flipping through my online searches for reviews of V for Vendetta, I did find one, link in the description, that outlines the arguments for why V is probably transgender. This includes the nature of the people who were rounded up for Larkhill, the hormone research conducted, the hiding of V's face, and the overall gender mystery that is V in the comics. I am pretty sure I didn't pick up on this during my initial read a decade ago, but I did come across this idea at some point in the intervening time, and it made all the sense in the world during this reread. But I'm not surprised a lot of people miss it and or don't talk about it. Sexuality-wise, it didn't play a super overt role in the book per se. Sex and sexuality is obviously present, but most of it is represented in the oppressive heteronormativity of gender roles under fascism. Some people mean to sexually assault Evie. As far as I can tell, there is much less commentary about the use of SA in V than in Watchmen, so we shall leave discussion of Moore's use of SA for that review. And Evie briefly participates in a heterosexual monogamous relationship, although perhaps it is more telling of me that part really just bounced off my brain. And the queer community is being actively exterminated by the fascist government. A nod to the ways queer people were another one of the minorities rounded up in concentration camps in World War II, and the anti-LGBTQ+ agenda of Thatcher. Not to mention the fact that this series initially started right as the HIV/AIDS epidemic was just getting underway. Queerphobic people use slurs. Similarly, racial diversity in England has been reduced under the authoritarian fascist government, although less is done to obviously balance that out with our selection of main characters in the comic. Racist people use slurs. Because I suspect I will not be reading and reviewing The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which I think I only read volume 1 of previously, please do review some of people's critiques of that work when it comes to race. Links in the description. Obviously, I don't want to gloss over critiques just because I don't think I'll feel up to reading it. Plus, being published between 1999 and 2019, this is some of his most recent work. And moving along to ability versus disability, as I already sort of touched on, it definitely feels like V and Evie both seem to have a superhuman ability to maintain full physical and mental ability, no matter how many adversities seek to overcome them. Bad people use ableist slurs. Bye y'all, keep reading and organize to end capitalist oppression.